Hello, my name is Meredith Duncan, and over this past year, I've had the pleasure of working with some amazing scientists from the University of New Orleans, Denison University, and the University of New Mexico Gallup. The flow of a medium, in this case water, can cause the passage of bed forms such as ripples and dunes, which in turn create physical sedimentary structures such as sets of cross strata. Dune height may be statistically reconstructed using set thickness measurements. However, to this day, there has not been a systematic investigation on how section orientation may influence efforts to reconstruct dune height from preserved set thicknesses. This study investigates how set thickness statistics change with section orientation to flow direction. The Bonnet Carré Spillway is a flood control structure on the Mississippi River. The 2019 flood resulted in the opening of the spillway, which created massive amounts of dune cross strata preserved in the sedimentary deposits. With the help of my associates, two shallow trenches intersecting at a right angle were excavated in the Bonnet Carré Spillway, one parallel to flow and one perpendicular. The flow perpendicular trench contained bounding surfaces that were extremely curved and non-parallel, whereas the flow parallel trench exhibited flatter sets with nearly even parallel bounding surfaces. These trenches were imaged using digital cameras, and orthophoto mosaics of the trenched surfaces were made using a structure for motion method. The bounding surfaces were then digitally mapped as vector lines using QGIS software. The vector lines were then used to calculate set thicknesses along a uniformly spaced grid. To explore set thickness statistic sensitivity to section orientation, a code was processed to locate the immediate top bounding surface of a set thickness. Then, it inserts the bounding surface to a grid and determines the exact difference between the top and bottom bounding surface elevation. Set thickness was calculated uniformly at 5 centimeter intervals along each trench. Statistics from a growing window analysis were used to determine the trench length and number of measurements required to attain steady statistical metrics. These observations will compare to a 3D volume of stratigraphy generated by a bedform stratiformation model. Our results show 530 set thickness measurements were taken from the flow parallel trench, with a mean of 5.97 centimeters and a standard deviation of 4.34 centimeters. As well as 594 measurements were taken from the flow perpendicular trench, with a mean of 9.71 centimeters and a standard deviation of 6.6 centimeters. The mean values and standard deviation of set thickness rapidly converge to separate values at about 100 measurements. However, the coefficient of variation rapidly converged to similar values at about 100 measurements. A mean thickness value and standard deviation value is determined faster with the flow parallel trench than the flow perpendicular trench. However, when you normalize the standard deviation by the mean, both trenches are the same within a few measurements. The change in mean and standard deviation is proportional. Therefore, it doesn't matter what flow orientation you take, so long as you look at the coefficient variation of the set thickness. Additionally, a two-sample Kolmogorov-Smirnov test was performed on growing populations of randomly subsampled flow parallel and perpendicular measurements. An ensemble of 500 realizations of growing Kolmogorov-Smirnov tests are performed and averaged to find a typical test result for a given size of subsample population. Typically, for subsampled populations of about 78 measurements, the hypothesis the two samples come from the same underlying probability distribution cannot be rejected. In conclusion, with the conditions of these trenches, the mean and standard deviation may be sensitive to flow trench alignment. However, the coefficient of variation may be less sensitive. Additionally, at roughly 100 random set thicknesses, flow parallel and perpendicular sets pass the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. In the future, our ongoing work will be continued by collecting more set thickness data from shallow trenches and comparing data to a numerical model of bedform stratigraphy. Lastly, I would like to thank the National Science Foundation for funding our research and all the participants from the University of New Orleans, Denison University, and the University of New Mexico Gallup. Thank you for listening.